woke racism and how a new religion is betraying Black America. So, okay, so that's quite the title. I mean, I'm sure it was very carefully chosen. And Wikipedia informed me that you're formally atheistic. And so, which may or may not be relevant to our discussion, but it's very interesting to me that you picked that as part of the title. Why do you believe that? Why this emphasis on a new religion? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, we're at a point where the kinds of beliefs that I'm talking about Black people, are no longer held as an opinion. It's at the point where a certain kind of person lives these beliefs in a way that is so impervious to any kind of reasonable discussion that you start to notice that it really is a matter of religion in the sense, particularly of Abrahamic religions, rather than opinion. And there are all sorts of things.
So what's the difference between religious belief and mere opinion in your estimation?
It is that many religions require that at a certain point you suspend disbelief and stop relying on conventional ratiocination and logic. There's a point at which you're supposed to have faith and believe in miracles of some sort. And it's at the point where when it comes to race, there are things that one is supposed to insist on and believe, regardless of whether they correspond to reality or even any sense of justice. One in Christianity is supposed to be dedicated to showing that you have faith in Jesus. Within the religion that I'm talking about, the cardinal point is that you show that you know that racism exists, just that you know that it exists. Now, what you're going to do about it is irrelevant. Whether or not what you're showing actually is racism is irrelevant. The fact is that you knew you were supposed to be looking for it. And only that imperative, as ding-dong as it sounds, explains a lot of the things that we've seen, especially lately. There was a real jump in the rails after summer 2020, but even before that. And it means that a lot of people look at what goes on with the race scene in the United States. And I know to an extent, there is that in Canada too. Whenever you see these sorts of things happening and you see brilliant people making arguments that don't make any sense and utterly despising those who disagree with them as if they were heretics, word chosen deliberately, it's because what we're seeing, even though these are people who are usually very secular in their self-conception, it's a religion. This is exactly the kind of person who sent Galileo into exile a very, very long time ago. And the people back then often didn't think of themselves as religious. It was just considered truth. We're faced with that same kind of thought, even if the word isn't applied. And the reason I'm putting it that way is not just to annoy people by calling them religious, although I think it will annoy them. And it'll also annoy actual religious experts who will say that I'm stepping outside of my lane, which I most definitely am. But all of this stuff only makes sense if you realize that these people are religious and that they have to be treated as parishioners and not as people who are up for an argument.
I've had a number of people make the same case to me recently, very profound people in my estimation. So I want to run a few ideas by you and see what you think. So I've thought a long time about the religious endeavor, let's say, from the psychological perspective, trying to unpack it. And it's related in some sense to the idea of depth. And so if you think about stories, literary stories, let's say, great works of literature for that matter, and lesser works, we all have this intuition that some stories are shallow, and they might be entertaining, but they're shallow, and some stories are deep. And we have the same sense in music, for that matter. But so we have this natural sense of depth, and part of what that is related to is something like place in the axiomatic structure of propositional thinking. So something is deep if a lot of other things you think depend on it, and it's shallow if you can dispense with that and it doesn't do much to your underlying cognitive architecture. So that seem reasonable so far?
Very much, yes.
Okay. And then I would say that there's a set of experiences that are universally human, more or less, that occur when our deeper beliefs are challenged. And that threatens the way that we construe the world and our ability to act in it. It threatens us with nihilism. It threatens us with chaos. It's no trivial matter. That happens often when heretofore separated cultures come into contact with one another.
Definitely.
So worlds can move when that occurs. Okay, so and then I would say that the set of emotions that are associated with the movement of deep beliefs are what we describe when we describe religious experience. And this is part of the reason I've had a number of conversations with famous atheists and very smart people. I mean, Harris, for example, is an extraordinarily smart person. And I'm familiar with Richard Dawkins' work and Daniel Dennett's work. These people are far from foolish, but they miss the point to me to some degree. Even scientifically speaking, because they treat religion as if it's a set of abstract propositions about the material structure of the world. And that's usually how the argument with religious people is framed. And they're often foolish enough to accept that initial framing. But there's a lot of phenomena that fall into the religious domain that have nothing to do with propositional truth. I mean, we already had a conversation about music, and music has often been used across many cultures for sacred purposes. And part of the reason for that is the emotional state that it's capable of invoking, which is something like awe at the deepest level, and also its ability to unite people in harmony, let's say, and in dance and all of that. And so there's no escaping the reality of the religious instinct. And here's the point I'm trying to make with all that to some degree. So imagine this, think about this for a second. So there's this statement in the New Testament that we should render unto God what is God's and unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And you'd be hard pressed to find a single statement ever uttered by anyone that had a more remarkable effect on the development of political systems. Because in some non-trivial manner, the idea that state and church should be separated is justified by that statement. So it's a deadly statement, but I also think it might be true psychologically. And that if we don't have an explicit territory marked out psychologically and socially for the sacred, and so that would be for the deepest things, then what happens is that things that should not be so deep start to take on exactly that aspect. And I'll finish this with one observation. I've been talking with someone I really admire. His name is Jonathan Pageau, and he's one of the deepest thinkers I've ever encountered in the religious domain. And he's well-versed in postmodernism.
Can you spell his last name?
Pageau.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, French-Canadian Catholic, turned atheist, turned Russian Orthodox icon carver. That's part of his background. Anyways, he made a very interesting comment in a talk I was watching on the weekend about false gods, let's say. And he talked about the danger of the idea of inclusivity when it's elevated to the highest place or put in the deepest place, let's say. And so if the purpose of all organizations becomes radical inclusivity, so that's the uniting factor, then the specific purpose of all those organizations is instantly threatened. And so part of the problem here is that what should be lower in the hierarchy of values is put in the higher place inappropriately, and that produces all sorts of social catastrophe.